Ladies and gentlemen, you wake up in the morning and you tell yourself a story about who you are, where you've been, and where you're going. It's a comfortable story, familiar, maybe even reassuring. But here's the problem, it's probably wrong. Because the person you think you are is a fraction of what you could be, and worse. It's often built on a foundation of self-deception, convenience, and avoidance. We assume that we know ourselves, that we've mapped out the territory of our own being. But that's simply not true. You don't even know the depths of your own motivations, the complexities of your fears, the vastness of your unrealized potential. You built an identity, but much of it is a defense mechanism, a shield against chaos, against suffering, against the unknown. You tell yourself this is just how I am. But really, what you mean is, this is the limit I've chosen to accept. Imagine for a moment that the person you are today is merely the shadow cast by a much larger, more formidable version of yourself. That greater self is buried beneath layers of habit, comfort, and unexamined assumptions. You've made choices, some consciously, many unconsciously, that have shaped this current version of you. And many of those choices were made to avoid discomfort, to sidestep responsibility, to escape confrontation with the difficult truths about yourself. Think about the last time you were truly challenged, truly tested. Did you rise to meet it? Or did you shrink away? Because here's something terrifying. You don't actually know how much you can take. You don't know how deep your courage runs, how much discipline you can muster, how profoundly you can change if necessity or catastrophe forces you to. People think they have limits. They say, I could never do that, or I'm just not that kind of person. But that's not reality. It's just the version of reality that is easiest to live with. History is full of people who thought they were one thing and became something else entirely. The timid become warriors. The lost become leaders. The broken become whole. And it happens when they are forced by suffering, by necessity, by the sheer weight of existence to confront who they really are beneath all their pretenses. What if you're wrong about yourself? What if you're capable of far more than you ever imagined? What if the version of you that you've accepted is a cheap imitation of what you could be if you actually faced the world with your eyes open? That thought should unsettle you, and it should also excite you. Because if you aren't who you think you are, then you are something else. And if you are something else, then the door is open, wide open for you to become something greater. Your self-identity is likely flawed, and not just in some minor superficial way, fundamentally at its very core. The way you see yourself, the way you define who you are, is often a convenient narrative rather than an objective truth. It's a story, one you've told yourself over and over, reinforced by your experiences, your failures, your successes, and most importantly, your fears. But here's the problem, that story is incomplete. Worse than that, it's deceptive. Because you are not merely who you think you are also everything you refuse to acknowledge about yourself. Human beings are unbelievably complex creatures. We are made up of desires, fears, instincts, emotions, and deep unconscious motivations, many of which we don't understand at all. But we like to believe we have ourselves figured out. Why? Because certainty is comfortable. Because predictability makes life easier. Because admitting that we don't fully know ourselves introduces an unbearable level of chaos into our existence. So instead of confronting the unknown within us, we construct a tidy, manageable version of ourselves, and we cling to it desperately. But think about this, how many times have you surprised yourself? Have you ever reacted in a way that made you stop and think, where did that come from? Maybe you lost your temper in a situation where you thought you were in control. Maybe you found unexpected courage when you assumed you were weak. Maybe you caved under pressure when you believed you were strong. What do these moments tell you? They tell you that you don't actually know yourself as well as you think you do. They tell you that there are parts of you lurking beneath the surface, parts that don't fit the clean, simple narrative you've constructed. And this is a serious problem, because if you don't know yourself, you are vulnerable. Vulnerable to manipulation, to self-sabotage, to failure. If you don't understand your own capacity for deception, then you will deceive yourself. If you don't acknowledge your own weaknesses, then you will remain weak. If you don't explore your own darkness, then it will control you in ways you can't predict. Carl Jung had a concept called the shadow, the part of ourselves that we refuse to acknowledge, the aspects of our nature that we repress because they don't align with the image we want to present to the world. And if you ignore your shadow, it doesn't go away. It festers. It grows. And eventually it bursts forth in moments of rage, in acts of betrayal, in self-destructive behavior that leaves you wondering, how could I have done that? This is why self-exploration is not just important, it's necessary. You need to ask yourself some very difficult questions. What am I pretending not to know about myself? What am I afraid to confront? What aspects of my nature do I ignore because they don't fit the version of me I want to believe in? Because the answer to these questions determines the trajectory of your life. If you lie to yourself about who you are, you will make decisions based on false assumptions. You will choose careers that don't suit you, relationships that don't fulfill you, and goals that don't align with your true potential. And when those things inevitably fail, you won't understand why. But here's the hopeful part: if your self-identity is flawed, that means it can be corrected. You are not bound by the limited version of yourself that you have accepted. You are capable of deeper insight, of greater self-awareness, of radical transformation. But that requires courage. It requires the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths, to explore the depths of your psyche, and to dismantle the convenient but false identity you have built for yourself. Because the truth is, you are far more than you think you are. You are stronger than you believe. You are more capable, more intelligent, more dangerous, and more noble than you allow yourself to realize. But you will never access that potential if you continue to live inside a false narrative. You must seek the truth, no matter how painful, no matter how unsettling. Because in truth, there is power. And in power, there is the ability to become something greater than you ever imagined. You are limiting yourself unconsciously, and that should deeply concern you. Because the limits you believe exist, the ceilings you think you've reached, the barriers you assume are immovable are often nothing more than psychological constructs, products of habit, fear, and a lack of genuine self-exploration. You don't know where your limits are. You only know where you've stopped testing them. And why do you stop? Why do you settle into predictable patterns, avoiding discomfort, rejecting risk, and convincing yourself that you've already reached the edge of your capabilities? It's because pushing beyond what is known is frightening. The human psyche seeks stability, familiarity, order. But here's the paradox: the greatest order you can achieve isn't found in rigid limitations. It's found in movement, in growth, in the continual stretching of your boundaries. Think about a time when you tried something difficult and failed. Maybe you attempted to learn a skill, start a business, pursue a goal that seemed just beyond your reach, only to fall short. What did you tell yourself afterward? Did you say, well, I guess that's just not for me? Did you decide that your failure was a reflection of an inherent limitation rather than a temporary obstacle? Most people do. And that's the mistake. Because here's the truth: you are much more than you currently understand. The potential within you is staggering, but you have built walls around it. Some of these walls were formed in childhood, when someone, maybe a teacher, a parent, or a peer, told you that you weren't smart enough, strong enough, or talented enough. Some of these walls are the result of past failures, moments where you were humiliated, discouraged, or hurt. Others are built out of sheer convenience because staying where you are is simply easier than facing the chaos of the unknown. But how many of these walls are real? How many of them would crumble if you simply tested them? How much of what you believe about yourself is just an illusion of security, a way to avoid the discomfort of realizing that you could be so much more, but that it would take serious effort? People say, I'm just not a disciplined person. Well, were you always undisciplined? Were you born that way? Or did you simply never take the necessary steps to train yourself into discipline? People say, I could never be a leader. Well, why not? Have you ever truly tested your ability to lead? Or have you simply accepted that as an immutable fact? Your limits are not where you think they are. You've drawn the borders of your competence too narrowly, and you live inside those constraints as though they are real. And here's where it gets even worse: because you believe in these limitations, you act in ways that reinforce them. If you think you're bad at public speaking, you avoid public speaking, which ensures you never get better at it. If you believe you can't handle stress, you run from stressful situations, which means you never develop the resilience necessary to endure hardship. You become the thing you believe you are, not because it's true, but because you refuse to challenge it. And what happens when you refuse to challenge yourself? You stagnate. You become bitter. You look at others who seem to be achieving great things and you tell yourself, well, they must have something I don't. But the truth is, they were willing to push past the limits that you assumed were real. They were willing to face discomfort, to embrace failure as a learning tool rather than a verdict on their worth. And you can do the same, but first, you have to admit something uncomfortable. You've been complicit in your own limitation. You've chosen, consciously or unconsciously, to remain smaller than you need to be. You've accepted the boundaries of your abilities without truly testing them. But if you can admit that, you can change it. What would happen if you pushed yourself just 10% harder? What if you took on a responsibility you thought was beyond you? What if you stopped saying, "I can't," and instead ask, "What would it take for me to be able to?" The moment you start asking those questions, you start tearing down the walls that have kept you trapped. And that's what growth looks like. That's what transformation is. You don't wake up one day as a better person, you fight for it. You confront the truth about yourself, the uncomfortable reality that you've been playing small, and you make a choice. A choice to push, to stretch, to become something more. Because if you're not doing that, then what exactly are you doing? You don't know your true potential, and that should unsettle you deeply. Because the version of yourself that you are today, the person you think you are, is not the full story. Not even close. You are operating at a fraction of your capacity, limited by assumptions, fears, and a lack of genuine confrontation with the unknown. And how do I know this? Because almost everyone does it. You look at your life, your abilities, your limitations, and you assume that they are fixed. That you are this kind of person, capable of these things and incapable of those. But you didn't arrive at that conclusion through rigorous testing. You arrived at it through habit, through conditioning, through the avoidance of difficulty. The truth is, you have no idea what you're capable of because you've never fully pushed yourself to find out. You've never demanded the absolute best of yourself over an extended period of time. You've never tested the limits of your endurance, your intelligence, your resilience, because doing so would require discomfort, perhaps suffering, and you, like most people, have avoided that suffering as much as possible. But here's the problem: without that suffering, without the challenge that forces you to grow, you will never come close to realizing who you could be. And that should bother you. Because if you don't know how strong you really are, how disciplined, how courageous, then you are walking through life blind to your own potential. And that means you are weaker than you need to be. Think about the times when you were truly tested, when you had no choice but to push beyond what you thought you could endure. Maybe it was an emergency, a crisis, a moment of intense pressure where something deep inside you awakened, and you rose to the occasion. You acted with more courage, more focus, more strength than you thought possible. And afterward, you might have wondered, where did that come from? That moment should have taught you something. It should have told you that you have reserves of potential you haven't even begun to tap into. But here's the tragic part. Most people never explore those reserves voluntarily. They wait until life forces them to, until catastrophe or necessity rips away their comfort and demands more from them. And then, only then, do they realize what they were capable of all along. And that means that right now, this very moment, you are likely capable of far more than you think. More strength, more intelligence, more endurance, more transformation. But because you have never fully tested those boundaries, you live under the illusion that you have none left to expand. This is why challenge is essential. This is why voluntarily confronting difficult things is not just beneficial, but necessary. If you never push beyond what you think you can handle, you will never grow. You will never become who you could be. And who you could be, that's terrifyingly unknown. Because what if you could be so much more? What if your dreams, your ambitions, your potential aren't just idle fantasies, but real possibilities that you've ignored because pursuing them would be difficult? The people who achieve extraordinary things are not fundamentally different from you. They don't have some mystical gift that you lack. What they have is the willingness to test their limits, to push beyond their comfort, to fail, to learn, to grow, to keep going when others would stop. They have confronted the unknown within themselves and emerged stronger for it. And so could you. But it starts with one thing: honesty. You have to be brutally honest with yourself about the fact that you don't actually know what your true limits are. And then you have to go out and test them. You have to set goals that scare you. You have to push yourself into uncomfortable situations. You have to strive towards something so difficult that it forces you to become more than you are. Because otherwise you will remain stuck, safe, comfortable, but ultimately stagnant. And that's not what you want. Not really, because deep down something in you knows there is more. Something in you is restless, dissatisfied with where you are, whispering that you could be greater, stronger, more capable than you ever imagined. That voice is your unrealized potential. And the question is, are you going to listen to it? Or are you going to ignore it, staying within the safe, familiar boundaries of who you think you are? That choice is yours, but understand this: if you never push yourself, if you never truly test what you're capable of, you will die without ever knowing who you could have been. And that is a tragedy far worse than failure, because failure at least means you tried. But never knowing, that is the slow, suffocating death of possibility. And that is something you cannot afford. People can radically transform. And that is one of the most hopeful, yet deeply unsettling, truths about human existence. Because if it's true, if you are capable of profound change, then it means the way you are now is not fixed. The person you've always been, the habits you've built, the limitations you've accepted, none of them are permanent. You are not finished. You are not carved in stone. You are a work in progress, and that means you have the ability to become something far greater than you are today. But here's the problem. Transformation isn't easy. It isn't comfortable. It requires sacrifice, discipline, and a willingness to step into the unknown. And that's why most people never do it. They cling to their familiar patterns even when those patterns make them miserable. They tell themselves, this is just who I am, as if their personality, their behaviors, their failures are written in the fabric of the universe. But that's not true. It's just an excuse to avoid the terrifying responsibility of change. You see this everywhere. People who have convinced themselves that they are fundamentally incapable of being different. The person who says, I've always been shy, I could never be confident. The person who believes, I've never been disciplined, I just don't have it in me. The person who insists, I've always struggled with this, it's just who I am. But if that were true, if change was impossible, then history would look very different. Because we have overwhelming evidence that people can and do radically transform. The coward can become courageous, the undisciplined can become focused, the lost can find direction. You see this in the stories of people who have rebuilt their lives from the ground up, people who have overcome addiction, risen from poverty, faced down immense suffering, and emerged stronger than before. And if they can do it, why can't you? The reason transformation seems so difficult is that it requires you to confront the parts of yourself that are weak, broken, and unexamined. It forces you to ask the hardest question of all: what would my life look like if I actually lived up to my potential? That question should scare you. Because if you answer it honestly, you will see just how much you've been avoiding, how many excuses you've made, how much responsibility you've refused to take. And that is not an easy thing to face. But the alternative, the refusal to change, is far worse, because if you don't transform, you decay. If you don't grow, you stagnate. If you refuse to step forward, you will be dragged backward by the weight of your own limitations. And that is a slow and miserable way to live. The path to transformation is clear, but it is not easy. It requires first admitting that you are not who you could be. That is the first and most painful step. Then it demands that you take action, real, deliberate, difficult action toward becoming that person. That means setting higher standards for yourself. It means sacrificing short-term pleasure for long-term meaning. It means embracing responsibility, discipline, and the pursuit of something greater than your immediate comfort. And it will be hard. You will fail. You will want to quit. You will doubt whether it's even possible. But if you persist, if you refuse to give in to that voice that tells you to stop, something remarkable happens. You start to change. You start to see glimpses of the person you could become. And the more you push forward, the more that person becomes real. So the question isn't, can I change? Because the answer to that is yes, unequivocally. The question is, will I? Because transformation is available to you, but it is not automatic. You must choose it. You must fight for it. And if you do, if you truly commit, you will become someone you never thought possible. And that is the greatest adventure of all. Your future self is still unwritten, and that should shake you to your core. Because it means that who you are today is not the final version of you. It means that the person you could become, the heights you could reach, the strength you could develop, the wisdom you could acquire is still unknown. And that presents both an incredible opportunity and a terrifying responsibility. The future is a landscape of infinite possibilities. Some of those possibilities lead to failure, suffering, and self-destruction. Others lead to competence, achievement, and meaning, and the choices you make moment by moment determine which path you follow. That's the burden of human existence. You are not static. You are constantly becoming something either better or worse. But most people don't think that way. They assume that who they are now is roughly who they will always be. They believe that their character, their abilities, and their circumstances are fixed. And because they believe that, they act accordingly. They avoid risk. They refuse responsibility. They stay trapped in patterns that don't serve them, because they've already decided, often unconsciously, that their future is just a slightly older version of their present. And that is a terrible mistake. Because your future self is not merely an extension of who you are now. Your future self is the result of everything you choose to do from this moment forward. That means you are either shaping yourself into someone stronger, wiser, and more capable, or you are allowing yourself to drift toward weakness, regret, and decay. There is no neutrality in life. You are not actively improving, you are deteriorating. This is why every choice matters. The small decisions you make today, the habits you build, the disciplines you practice, the fears you confront are laying the foundation for the person you will become. If you choose to avoid difficulty now, your future self will be weaker for it. If you refuse to take responsibility today, your future self will suffer under the weight of accumulated failure. But if you push yourself towards something difficult, if you strive toward meaning and competence, your future self will thank you in ways you cannot yet imagine. Think about this. Who could you be in 5 years if you truly committed to becoming better? If you disciplined yourself properly, if you pursued what was meaningful instead of what was expedient, if you confronted your weaknesses instead of hiding from them, how much could you change? How much stronger, smarter, more resilient could you be? The answer is far more than you think. And that should fill you with both excitement and urgency, because time is passing whether you like it or not. 5 years will come and go, regardless of what you do. And when that time arrives, you will either look back and see that you've become someone you respect, someone competent, courageous, and full of purpose, or you will see that you have wasted your time, that you have let yourself become someone you barely recognize. That is the choice. And it is always in front of you. You can decide right now to aim higher, to expect more of yourself, to take your life seriously. You can decide to build something meaningful, to become someone whose existence is valuable, not just to yourself, but to those around you. Or you can drift, allowing yourself to be shaped by circumstance and comfort, hoping that somehow things will just work out, but they won't. Not unless you take responsibility, not unless you consciously and deliberately shape your own becoming. Because your future self is coming whether you are prepared for it or not. And the only question is, who will you be when that day arrives? Because if you truly commit, then the world will open up in ways you never thought possible. You will become someone you respect, someone who can bear the burdens of life with strength and dignity, someone who makes things better rather than worse. And that is no small thing. So don't wait. Don't tell yourself that change will come someday. It won't unless you make it happen. Start now, aim at something worth striving for, take a step forward, however small, and keep moving. Because your future self is waiting, and the only way to meet them is to build them one decision at a time.